This is Marcus Bennett, a 35-year-old billionaire in the real estate sector. He had planned to humiliate his ex-girlfriend at his luxury wedding. He thought she would stand there, broken and desperate, singing for money while he celebrated with his new bride. Marcus wanted everyone to see how far he had risen and how far she had fallen. He wanted to prove that he had triumphed, wealthy and powerful, and that she no longer mattered. But when Vivian Foster opened her mouth to sing, what came out changed everything. The song she sang exposed secrets that turned his perfect wedding into a disaster. And that was only the beginning. Atlanta, Georgia, the Grand Buckhead Hotel had been transformed into something out of a fairy tale. Crystal chandeliers reflected light across polished marble floors. 350 chairs covered in ivory silk formed perfect rows. White roses and orchids covered every available surface, everything calculated to project wealth, taste, and refinement, everything designed to impress. I had arrived at 2 in the afternoon to oversee the final details that Marcus had asked me to manage, and it was at 4:45 that she walked in. As if Marcus wanted to make absolutely certain that everyone would notice her, that she would stand out, that her presence and her condition would be impossible to ignore. But what struck me most was not the dress or the pregnancy. It was her face. She looked tired, that deep tiredness that comes from months of stress and worry. Dark circles shadowed her eyes, but despite the exhaustion, despite the obvious signs of struggle, there was something in Vivian's eyes that surprised me. Not defeat, not shame. Something harder, something that looked almost like determination. Vivian simply nodded quietly and allowed Patricia to guide her to the small platform that had been set up beside the altar. When Vivian climbed onto that platform, I saw her grimace slightly, one hand going to her lower back, in that universal gesture of late pregnancy discomfort. There was something raw now, something that sounded like it had been broken and imperfectly healed. Pain, yes, but also something more. Something that sounded like carefully controlled anger channeled into music. Because I had seen the worn leather folder that Vivian was carrying, and I had seen the sheet music inside it when she opened it briefly. They were not just the traditional songs that Patricia had requested. I stood at the edge of that ballroom, watching Vivian Foster adjust her microphone stand with hands that trembled ever so slightly, and I said nothing. That is what butlers do. We observe. We remain composed. We maintain discretion even when we see things that disturb us deeply. But inside, I felt something that I rarely allowed myself to feel in the presence of my employers and their guests. I felt anger on behalf of someone who had been treated with calculated cruelty. I first met Vivian Foster in February of 1987, 9 months before that wedding. She had been at the Bennett mansion almost every weekend for 6 months by then, though I had never been formally introduced to her. Marcus kept his personal life separated from his household staff in a way that spoke volumes about how he viewed the people who worked for him. We were there to serve, not to know, but I knew Vivian nonetheless. I knew her by the sound of her laughter echoing through the halls on Saturday mornings. I knew her by the way she would thank the kitchen staff personally when they prepared meals. I knew her by the sheet music she would leave on the piano in the library, pieces by composers I recognized and admired. Her voice, I learned from conversations I overheard, had earned her scholarships and accolades throughout her academic career. She had been preparing for a career in opera when she met Marcus at a charity gala in December of 1986. He had pursued her with the single-minded focus that he brought to his real estate acquisitions. Flowers every day, dinner at the finest restaurants in Atlanta, weekend trips to New York and Paris. He wanted her, and Marcus Bennett always got what he wanted. Marcus had called me into his study the previous evening with instructions that Miss Foster would be leaving early in the morning and that I should ensure a car was ready for her. His tone had been clipped, businesslike, as if he were discussing the disposal of an unwanted piece of furniture rather than a woman who had been a regular presence in his home for half a year. Her eyes were red, swollen from crying, but her back was straight. She wore a simple blue dress that I would later realize hung differently on her frame because she was already carrying the secret that Marcus had decided made her unsuitable for his world. When she reached the bottom of the stairs, Marcus was waiting for her in the foyer. I could not hear their words from where I stood, but I could see the rigid set of his shoulders, the dismissive wave of his hand, the way he turned his back on her before she had even finished speaking. He said she had thanked him when he helped her with her suitcase, which was more courtesy than Marcus had shown any of us in recent weeks. The months between February and November passed with the measured pace of seasons changing. Marcus threw himself into his work with renewed energy, as if dismissing Vivian had freed him from some burden. He closed 3 major real estate deals that spring, each one adding millions to his already substantial fortune. He appeared on the cover of Atlanta Business Chronicle in May, photographed in front of one of his newest acquisitions, a gleaming office tower in the heart of downtown. The article called him a visionary, a man who had transformed Atlanta's skyline with his bold investments and strategic brilliance. They call it anything except what it truly is. Isabel stood beside him, a tall, slender woman with pale blonde hair and the kind of polished beauty that comes from generations of privilege and careful breeding. She wore a diamond engagement ring that must have cost more than most people earn in a year. A reception that would showcase the best of Atlanta's culinary and artistic talent. Every detail would be perfect, because nothing less would be acceptable for the union of the Bennett and Hartwell families. She was marrying him for reasons that had everything to do with maintaining her family's social position and nothing to do with love. And Marcus, I suspected, knew this and did not care. He wanted a wife with the right pedigree, the right connections, the right last name. Isabel Hartwell checked every box on his list of requirements. I learned about it in August, 3 months before the wedding. Marcus had called me into his study on a Thursday evening. He was sitting behind his massive mahogany desk, a glass of bourbon in one hand and a manila folder in the other. He looked pleased with himself in a way that made me uneasy, someone who would add an element of sophistication to the event. He handed me the folder, and when I opened it, I saw a contract with Vivian Foster's name on it. The fee was $3,500, a sum that Marcus knew was substantial enough to be tempting for someone in Vivian's circumstances, but insulting compared to what he was spending on every other aspect of the wedding. I have witnessed financial impropriety, marital infidelity, and casual cruelty toward those with less power. But this was different. This was not merely cruel. It was calculated humiliation, designed and executed with the precision that Marcus brought to his most ruthless business deals. He wanted her to see what she had lost. He wanted her to stand in front of 350 guests from Atlanta's elite society and sing at the wedding of the man who had discarded her. He wanted everyone to see the contrast between his new bride, with her impeccable pedigree and trust fund, and his former girlfriend, reduced to accepting payment to perform at his wedding. There was something darker, something that looked like the need to prove that he had been right to dismiss her, that she had been unworthy all along, that her fall from his favor was evidence of some fundamental flaw in her character rather than in his. And then I went to my quarters and felt something that I had not felt in many years. I felt ashamed to be associated, even tangentially, with such calculated cruelty. Patricia Monroe, the wedding planner, seemed to live at the Bennett mansion, coordinating every detail with the kind of manic energy that comes from knowing that a single mistake could ruin her reputation. Isabel visited frequently, always impeccably dressed, always polite in a distant way that made it clear she viewed the staff as interchangeable and largely invisible. And through it all, Marcus moved with the confidence of a man who believed he controlled every variable, every outcome, every person in his orbit. She asked whether she could include one original composition in addition to the traditional pieces requested by the wedding planner. I told her I would inquire with Mr. Bennett. She thanked me quietly and said she would see me at the rehearsal. It was a smaller affair, just the wedding party and immediate family, but Marcus had insisted that Vivian attend to run through her performance. She arrived at 6 in the evening, accompanied by no one. I watched her enter the Grand Buckhead Hotel with that same worn leather folder tucked under one arm. She moved slowly, one hand pressed to her lower back, her pregnant belly making every step an effort. Vivian sang through Ave Maria and Pachelbel's Canon in D without incident. Her voice was beautiful, technically flawless, though I noticed again that raw quality I had heard during the sound check. When she finished, Patricia Monroe thanked her briskly and informed her that she should arrive by 4 o'clock the next day to prepare for the ceremony at 6. As Vivian descended from the platform, Marcus looked up. Their eyes met for perhaps 3 seconds. He smiled, a smile that did not reach his eyes, a smile that was meant to convey his satisfaction at her reduced circumstances. Vivian did not smile back. She simply looked at him with an expression I could not quite read. Then she turned and walked toward the exit. I caught up with her in the hotel corridor, away from the ears of the wedding party. "Miss Foster," I said. She turned and I saw that her eyes were bright with unshed tears. But they were not tears of sadness or defeat. They were something else entirely. "Tomorrow will be difficult, but it will also be necessary." And then she walked away, leaving me standing in that corridor wondering what she meant. I simply watched her leave and hoped that Marcus's cruelty would at least be over quickly, that Vivian could collect her fee and leave with some small portion of her dignity intact. Atlanta in autumn can be beautiful, and that Saturday was no exception. The temperature was perfect, cool enough for elegant formal wear, but not so cold as to be uncomfortable. It was, as Patricia Monroe announced to anyone who would listen, ideal wedding weather, as if even nature had conspired to give Marcus Bennett exactly what he wanted. The ballroom looked like something from a magazine spread on luxury weddings. Everything was white and gold and crystal. Thousands of roses, each one perfect, created cascading arrangements on every table. The chairs were covered in ivory silk with gold sashes. The lighting had been adjusted to create a warm, flattering glow that would make everyone look their best in photographs. It was beauty without warmth, elegance without soul, perfection without purpose beyond displaying wealth. I have seen this kind of beauty many times in my years of service. It is the beauty of things rather than of moments, of displays rather than of connections, of surfaces rather than of depths. Photographers testing angles and lighting. Everyone moved with practiced efficiency, creating the kind of seamless, invisible service that the wealthy expect and rarely acknowledge. He was dressed in dark slacks and a white dress shirt, saving his tuxedo for later, but even in casual attire, he projected an air of ownership and control. I saw her only briefly as she passed through the lobby, but I noticed that she looked tense, her smile forced, as if she were preparing for an ordeal rather than a celebration. And at 4:45, exactly on schedule, Vivian Foster walked through the entrance of the Grand Buckhead Hotel for the second time. Her dark hair was pulled back in a simple style that emphasized the elegant lines of her face. She wore no jewelry except for small gold earrings. She carried that same worn leather folder that I had seen at the rehearsal. But despite the exhaustion, despite the obvious strain of late pregnancy, there was something in the way she held herself that commanded attention. She moved slowly, but with purpose, as if every step had been calculated, as if she knew exactly where she was going and what she planned to do when she arrived. The planner looked Vivian up and down, with an expression that suggested she found the yellow dress as distasteful as I did, but was too professional to say so. She guided Vivian toward the small platform beside the altar, where she would stand during the ceremony, going over the schedule one final time. Ceremony at 6. 2 songs during the ceremony, 1 song at the beginning of cocktail hour. Then Vivian would be free to leave. As if Vivian were some kind of temporary inconvenience to be endured and dismissed. as if her presence were contaminating the carefully curated elegance of Marcus Bennett's perfect day. Among the traditional pieces, among the songs that Patricia Monroe had approved, there were other pages. Pages covered in musical notation and handwritten lyrics. Pages that Vivian handled with particular care, placing them on top of the stack where they would be easily accessible. And for the first time, I felt a flutter of apprehension that had nothing to do with concern for Vivian's well-being and everything to do with the growing certainty that something was about to happen, something that Marcus Bennett, in his arrogance and cruelty, had not anticipated. They entered the hotel dressed in tuxedos and evening gowns, dripping with jewelry and confidence and the easy assurance that comes from a lifetime of privilege. I recognized many of them: real estate developers, banking executives, old Atlanta families whose wealth stretched back generations, politicians who depended on contributions from men like Marcus Bennett, society women whose primary occupation was maintaining their position in the rigid hierarchy of Atlanta's elite. They moved through the hotel lobby and into the ballroom, greeting each other with air kisses and practiced charm. They accepted champagne from servers in crisp white uniforms. They admired the floral arrangements and the lighting and the sheer opulence of the setting. They took their seats in those ivory, silk-covered chairs and waited for the ceremony to begin. I've learned over the years that the wealthy, for all their emphasis on discretion and propriety, gossip with the same enthusiasm as anyone else. They simply do it more quietly, in corners and alcoves, behind raised champagne flutes and carefully composed expressions. I heard fragments of conversation as I moved through the ballroom, ensuring that everything was proceeding according to schedule. There was talk about the merger between Bennett Properties and Hartwell Trust and Investments, the financial alliance that this wedding was meant to cement. There was speculation about Marcus's political ambitions, rumors that he planned to run for state office within the next few years. There was commentary on Isabel's dress, which no one had seen yet, but which was rumored to be a custom creation from a famous designer. There was discussion of the honeymoon destination, reportedly a private island in the Caribbean. And I saw that she was watching the guests with an expression of profound sadness, mixed with something that looked like resignation. She was seeing the world that Marcus had decided she could never be part of, the society that had deemed her unworthy, the people who would have judged her by her last name and her background rather than by her talent or her character. She was seeing everything she had lost when Marcus dismissed her, and perhaps everything she was about to expose. At 5:55, Patricia Monroe signaled for the guests to take their seats. The low murmur of conversation faded to expectant silence. The string quartet that had been playing soft background music shifted into position. The officiant, a distinguished-looking man in his 60s, took his place at the altar. The groomsmen and bridesmaids processed down the aisle in perfectly timed intervals, their smiles bright and their movements rehearsed. And then Marcus Bennett walked down the aisle alone, without his father who had passed away 3 years earlier, carrying himself with the pride of a man who had built an empire and was now claiming the ultimate symbol of his success. He took his position at the altar, his back to the guests, facing the doors through which his bride would enter. And Vivian Foster, 8 months pregnant in her yellow dress, began to sing. But I was watching Vivian's face, and I saw the moment when something shifted in her expression, when the polite, professional mask slipped just slightly, when her eyes found Marcus's back and held there with an intensity that made me hold my breath. The guests rose to their feet in a rustle of fabric and a soft exhalation of admiration. She looked at Marcus one final time, and she began to sing something that Patricia Monroe had not approved, that no one except Vivian herself had heard, that was about to transform this perfect wedding into something entirely different. Not the fairy tale of true love and perfect unions, but the truth, the ugly, complicated, devastating truth. And then, when she told him she was carrying his child, a man who had looked at her with cold calculation and said words that would haunt her for the rest of her life, The guests remained standing, trapped between their positions of respect for the bride and their complete inability to process what was happening. She sang about charity funds, about a non-profit organization that her mother had founded and directed, an organization dedicated to providing music education to underprivileged children in Atlanta, an organization that had received a substantial donation from Bennett Properties in January of 1987, a donation that Marcus had personally overseen. According to Vivian's lyrics, delivered with devastating precision, Marcus had diverted those funds through a series of shell companies, using the charitable contribution as a tax write-off while pocketing the money for himself. And when the non-profit began asking questions about the missing funds, Marcus had used his connections to have their operations investigated, leading to their bankruptcy and the destruction of Vivian's mother's reputation. Punishment for Vivian's refusal to quietly disappear after he dismissed her. Revenge for her insistence on keeping the baby despite his suggestion that she end the pregnancy. Cruelty so calculated and comprehensive that it had destroyed not just Vivian's future, but her mother's life work. Marcus reached the platform and grabbed for the microphone stand. Vivian stepped back smoothly, still singing, her eyes never leaving his face. Security guards, confused about whether to intervene, hesitated at the edge of the ballroom. Patricia Monroe looked like she might faint. And Isabel Hartwell, perfect Isabel with her perfect pedigree and her perfect trust fund, made a sound that was somewhere between a sob and a scream. Because in that moment, standing in her wedding dress in front of 350 guests from Atlanta's elite, Isabel Hartwell understood that she was not marrying a successful businessman with political ambitions. She was marrying a man who had committed fraud, a man who had destroyed lives out of spite, a man who had orchestrated her entire wedding day as an extended act of cruelty toward a pregnant woman he had discarded. And Isabel Hartwell, for all her privilege and her polished exterior, was not stupid. She turned around, her wedding dress sweeping across the marble floor, and walked out of the Grand Buckhead Hotel without saying a single word. Patricia Monroe was crying into her phone, presumably trying to reach her lawyer. The string quartet had fled their position near the altar. Servers stood frozen with trays of champagne, unsure whether to continue service or abandon their posts. It was about her children, the twins she was carrying, and her promise to them that they would grow up knowing the truth about their father. That they would understand that his rejection of them said everything about his character and nothing about their worth, that they would be loved and valued and raised to be everything he was not. She stepped down from the platform, moving slowly because of her pregnant belly, moving carefully because every eye in the room was on her, and she walked toward the exit with her head high and her shoulders back. A woman who had just burned down her own future, but had also finally told her truth. I wanted to tell her that she had exposed not just Marcus Bennett's cruelty, but the entire system that protected men like him, that valued breeding over character, that measured worth in bank accounts and last names. What I didn't know then, what I couldn't have known in that moment of chaos and revelation, was that this was not the end of Marcus Bennett's story. It was barely the beginning, because what Vivian had exposed that night was just one piece of a much larger web of corruption and cruelty, and in the days and weeks that followed, other pieces would come to light, other victims would speak up, other secrets would be revealed. And what happened next, what I discovered in the weeks following that disastrous wedding, would change everything I thought I knew about Marcus Bennett, about Vivian Foster, and about the true cost of silence. And behind that door was something that would destroy not just his reputation, but his entire empire. About the way Marcus's carefully constructed world began to crumble, piece by piece, as the truth spread through Atlanta's elite society with the speed of wildfire. That she had not simply exposed Marcus's crimes in a moment of emotional desperation. The newspaper headline on Tuesday morning read, "Bennett Properties under federal investigation for charity fraud." Beneath it, a photograph showed Marcus leaving his attorney's office, his face hidden behind his hand, his usual confidence replaced by something that looked very much like fear. I was sitting in the kitchen of the Bennett mansion, drinking my morning coffee, when I saw it. And in that moment, I understood that what had happened at the wedding was not an isolated incident of revenge. It was the opening move in a much larger game. She had turned her moment of humiliation into a strategic strike that would bring down not just Marcus's reputation, but his entire business empire. And usually they are right. But occasionally, very occasionally, someone comes along who understands how to strike at those foundations. Someone who has been hurt badly enough to accept the cost of revelation. Someone like Vivian Foster. Board members from Bennett Properties calling emergency meetings. Marcus's assistant, Caroline, a competent woman in her 40s who had worked for him for 8 years, resigned via email on Tuesday afternoon. 3 other executives followed her by Wednesday. Through the closed door, I could hear him on the phone, his voice alternating between rage and something that sounded dangerously close to panic. He was trying to contain the damage, to manage the narrative, to use his connections and his resources to make this problem disappear. But for the first time in his life, Marcus Bennett was discovering that some problems cannot be solved with money and influence. The documents that Vivian had left on the platform at the Grand Buckhead Hotel had made their way into the hands of several reporters by Monday evening. Copies, I learned later, had been distributed strategically to ensure that even if one publication hesitated to run the story, others would not. By Tuesday afternoon, every major newspaper in Atlanta had published some version of the scandal. By Wednesday, it had gone national. Wealth and corruption, betrayal and revenge, a pregnant woman humiliated at her ex-lover's wedding, a billionaire exposed as a fraud, and beneath it all, a narrative that resonated with anyone who had ever felt powerless in the face of institutional cruelty. Vivian Foster became, overnight, a symbol of courage and resistance. Marcus Bennett became a symbol of everything people despised about the wealthy and privileged. But what the newspapers did not report, what the public did not know, was that the charity fraud was only the beginning. The investigation that Vivian had helped initiate would eventually uncover a pattern of financial crimes that stretched back years. Shell companies used to hide income, bribes paid to city officials to secure zoning approvals, intimidation of competitors through legal harassment. A systematic pattern of behavior that revealed Marcus Bennett not as a visionary businessman, but as someone who had built his fortune through manipulation and corruption. I learned them through the parade of federal investigators who arrived at the mansion with subpoenas and questions, treating the home I had maintained with such care as a crime scene to be searched and documented. A whistleblower who had tried to report financial irregularities at Bennett Properties and found himself unemployable after Marcus called in favors with colleagues across the industry. A journalist who had written a critical article about one of Marcus's developments and subsequently faced a lawsuit that bankrupted her small publication. A former business partner who had objected to Marcus's methods and found his own company targeted for investigation by regulatory agencies that Marcus had connections with. He had created a network of people who owed him favors, who depended on his goodwill, who would look the other way when he crossed lines because doing so served their interests as well as his. She had forced people to choose sides, and enough of them had chosen truth over complicity to bring the entire structure crashing down. I watched it happen from my position in the household, maintaining my duties with professional detachment while feeling something I had rarely experienced in my years of service. I felt satisfaction. Not pleasure in another person's suffering, but satisfaction that justice, real justice, was finally being served. That a man who had caused so much harm through his cruelty and his arrogance was facing consequences that his money and his connections could not prevent. But what I didn't know yet What would only become clear in the months that followed was how completely Marcus's world would unravel, how the investigation would expand beyond financial crimes to reveal other abuses of power, how more people would come forward with their own stories of being victimized by Marcus Bennett, how the empire he had built over 15 years would collapse in less than 6 months. And I didn't know what had happened to Vivian Foster after she walked out of the Grand Buckhead Hotel that November night. Whether she was safe, whether she had somewhere to go, whether the courage she had shown in exposing Marcus had cost her more than she could afford to pay. I was in the study, organizing files that Marcus had asked me to prepare for his legal team, when I found a letter tucked between 2 folders. It was addressed to Marcus, postmarked the day after the wedding, sent from an address in Virginia Highland that I recognized as Vivian's neighborhood. Perhaps it was the growing certainty that Marcus Bennett did not deserve the loyalty I had given him for so many years. Whatever the reason, I carefully opened the envelope and read the letter inside. She wrote that she had known about Marcus's fraud for months before the wedding. She had discovered it accidentally in March, just weeks after he had dismissed her from his life. Her mother, desperate to understand why the promised donation from Bennett Properties had never arrived, had hired a forensic accountant to trace the funds. That accountant had found the shell companies, the diverted money, the systematic pattern of fraud. He had also found other irregularities that suggested the charity fraud was part of a larger pattern. She wanted to be the one to reveal the truth, not in a courtroom or a deposition room, but in public, in front of the people whose approval and acceptance Marcus valued above everything else. She wanted him to feel, even for a moment, the humiliation and powerlessness that he had inflicted on her. She had accepted Marcus's offer to sing, not because she needed the money, though she did, but because it gave her the perfect platform for her revelation. She had composed her song over months, carefully crafting lyrics that told her story, while also referencing specific details of Marcus's fraud. She had practiced until she could deliver it flawlessly, even while 8 months pregnant, even while facing the man who had betrayed her. She wrote, "I know that what I did was not noble or dignified. I know that many people will judge me for it, but I also know that silence protects abusers, and that speaking truth to power requires accepting the cost of being seen as difficult, as vindictive, as unladylike. I accepted that cost, and I would accept it again, because my children deserve to grow up in a world where cruelty has consequences and where the powerful cannot hide behind their money and their connections." What I didn't tell anyone then, what I kept to myself for reasons I did not fully understand, was that the letter had included a postscript, just a single line at the bottom of the page, written in smaller letters, as if Vivian had added it as an afterthought. It read, "Thank you for your kindness. You will understand why I did this when you see what happens next." She was referring to that moment in the hotel corridor after the rehearsal, when I had tried to offer comfort, when I had followed her with some vague impulse to help, even though I had no idea how. She had seen that gesture, small and insufficient as it was, and she had acknowledged it. And somehow, in the midst of planning her public revenge, she had thought to thank me for it. Ashamed that I had maintained my professional discretion for so long while witnessing Marcus's cruelty. Ashamed that it had taken Vivian Foster's courage to make me question my own complicity in the systems that protected men like Marcus Bennett. The indictment detailed a pattern of criminal activity that stretched back 7 years and involved millions of dollars in diverted funds, fraudulent tax deductions, and bribery of public officials. The charity boards he had served on quietly asked for his resignation. Isabel Hartwell's family, through their attorneys, made it clear that any attempt by Marcus to contact Isabel would result in legal action. The cook, the driver, the personal assistant, all departed within weeks of each other. I could no longer serve a man whose cruelty and corruption I had witnessed so thoroughly. He accepted my resignation with barely a response, too consumed by his legal troubles to care about household arrangements. I made copies of certain documents that had passed through my hands during those months of investigation, phone records that showed Marcus's communications with city officials, financial statements that revealed the flow of money through shell companies, emails that documented his systematic retaliation against anyone who challenged him. I made copies, and I sent them anonymously to the federal prosecutors handling Marcus's case. They likely already had most of this information through their own investigation, but I wanted to do something, however small, to ensure that Marcus Bennett faced the full consequences of his actions. I wanted to be, in some small way, less complicit in the systems that had protected him for so long. That they would help prosecutors build a case that was not just about financial fraud, but about systematic abuse of power. That they would contribute to a conviction that would send Marcus Bennett to federal prison for 8 years. And through it all, I would follow the case from a distance, reading newspaper articles and court documents, watching as the man I had served for 6 years was finally held accountable for his crimes. I worked for them for 3 years before semi-retiring in 1991, taking occasional positions as needed, but mostly enjoying the freedom of my later years. 2 children, perhaps 4 years old, a boy and a girl with dark curly hair and bright, curious eyes. They were laughing at something, their voices high and joyful. She had gained back the weight she had lost during her pregnancy. Her face had filled out, the sharp angles softened. Her eyes, which I remembered as tired and strained, now looked clear and calm. We talked for nearly an hour, standing there in the park, while her children played on the swings nearby. She told me that raising them alone had been difficult, but that she had help from her mother and friends, people who had stood by her even when her public revelation had made her controversial. She told me that she had testified at Marcus's trial and that seeing him convicted and sentenced had given her a sense of closure she had not expected. She spoke with the fierce love that all parents have for their children, but also with something deeper, with the knowledge that she had fought for them before they were even born, that she had risked everything to ensure they would grow up knowing the truth about their father. Then she said something I have never forgotten. Because her children were safe, because other people had been protected from Marcus's cruelty, because she had spoken truth to power and survived. I watched David and Diana grow into remarkable young people, intelligent and kind, and completely unaware that their existence had once been deemed inconvenient by a man who measured worth in pedigrees and bank accounts. She created a life of meaning and purpose that did not require wealth or social status or any of the markers that Marcus had valued above everything else. Because accepting his money, she explained, would have meant accepting some level of obligation to him, and she wanted her children to owe him nothing, to be beholden to him in no way, to understand that they were complete and valuable, entirely independent of any connection to the man who had rejected them before they were born. I read about it in the newspaper, a brief article buried in the business section. He had lost everything during his incarceration. Bennett properties had been liquidated to pay fines and restitution. His personal assets had been seized or sold. The mansion in Buckhead, where I had worked for 6 years, had been purchased by a technology entrepreneur and converted into something entirely different. The photographs that accompanied the article showed a man who looked much older than his 44 years. His hair was grey. His face was lined. His shoulders were stooped. He looked like a man who had been broken by the consequences of his own actions. That a man who had caused tremendous harm had faced real consequences. That the system, despite all its flaws and all the ways it typically protects the wealthy and powerful, had occasionally worked as it should. He had been working as a property manager for a small real estate company, living in a modest apartment, his former wealth and status reduced to distant memory. The obituary mentioned his early business success, but made only vague reference to his later legal troubles. There was no mention of children, no mention of Vivian Foster or the twins whose existence he had rejected. Perhaps because I had known him during his years of triumph and felt some obligation to witness his ending. Perhaps because I wanted to see who else would come, what kind of legacy he would leave behind. The service was small, sparsely attended. A few former business associates, some distant relatives, his attorney, no one who seemed genuinely grieved by his passing. David and Diana were 19 years old, both attending college, both having grown up with no meaningful connection to their father. His death would be just another fact about a man they had never known, and I saw no reason to burden them with it. I maintained my friendship with Vivian and stayed in touch with David and Diana as they became adults. I watched them graduate from college, start careers, build lives that reflected their mother's values and strength. Both of them chose careers focused on service and community rather than on accumulation of wealth or status. Both of them embodied values that were the opposite of everything their father had represented. She performed occasionally in local venues, her voice still beautiful even as she moved into her 50s and then her 60s. She never spoke publicly about Marcus Bennett or about that November night in 1987. She had told her truth once, in the most dramatic way possible, and she felt no need to revisit it. I have been retired fully for several years, though I still maintain my connections to the families I served over my 4 decades in private service. And I find myself thinking often about that night at the Grand Buckhead Hotel, about Vivian Foster standing on that platform in her yellow dress, 8 months pregnant, preparing to expose the man who had betrayed her, about the courage it took to do what she did, about the cost she paid and the justice she achieved. I think about Marcus Bennett too, though with less frequency, about how a man with every advantage, every opportunity, every resource could make choices that led to such complete destruction, about how cruelty, even when it seems to carry no immediate consequences, eventually catches up with those who practice it, about how the systems that protect the wealthy and powerful are not impenetrable, though they often seem that way. But mostly, I think about the lessons I learned from witnessing that story unfold, about the importance of speaking truth even when silence seems safer, about the way that remaining neutral in situations of injustice is its own form of taking sides, about how real courage often looks like a pregnant woman singing a song that will cost her everything she has left to lose. I saw financial impropriety and personal betrayal. I saw kindness and cruelty in equal measure. I saw people at their best and at their worst. But I never saw anything quite like what Vivian Foster did on that November night in 1987. That the discretion I had prized so highly in my professional life was sometimes just another word for cowardice. That true courage requires accepting the cost of speaking up, even when that cost is substantial. And I have learned that wealth, real wealth, is not measured in bank accounts or property holdings or investment portfolios. She lost everything that society tells us matters: status, comfort, security, the approval of powerful people. But she gained something far more valuable: the knowledge that she had fought for what was right, that she had protected her children and others from a man who would have continued to cause harm, that she had spoken truth to power and survived, that her courage had made a difference. And her children, David and Diana, grew up knowing that their mother was someone who stood up for herself, and others even when doing so was costly. They grew up understanding that character matters more than wealth, that integrity cannot be bought or sold, that the measure of a person is not their bank account, but their actions in moments that test them. But the life she built after that moment, the children she raised, the values she passed on, the example she set of what it means to survive betrayal with grace and to transform pain into purpose. His final years were marked by obscurity and regret, and when he died, he left behind no one who mourned him with genuine grief. And that real wealth has nothing to do with bank accounts and everything to do with how we treat the people around us when we think no one important is watching. Perhaps you watched someone powerful brought low by their own cruelty, or saw an act of courage that changed lives in ways that rippled outward for years. Share your story in the comments below. These memories matter. They remind us that justice, however delayed, however imperfect, is always worth pursuing. And if you know someone who needs to hear Vivian's story, someone who needs to be reminded that courage comes in many forms and that speaking truth to power is never wasted, share this video with them. Sometimes the stories that change us are the ones we pass along to others. Sometimes the lessons we learn from witnessing another person's courage give us the strength to find our own. It is not measured in mansions or yachts or private planes. It is measured in the lives we touch when no one is watching, in the courage we show when silence would be easier, and in the truth we speak when lies would be more convenient. That is the lesson I learned from 40 years of service to the wealthy. That is what Vivian Foster taught me on a November night in 1987. And that is what I hope you will remember long after this story ends.